Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm John Field. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Executive Secretary at the Pacific Salmon Commission headquarters here in Vancouver. Welcome to another presentation from our ongoing PSC Seminar Series. You might know the global title for this series is Environmental Change and Pacific Salmon Management, the view from both sides of the border. Today will be the 24th installment of that series. And you might know that the intention was to provide information from both Western and Indigenous perspectives on environmental change, including its effects on salmon across their life cycle and salmon management in both countries. Each seminar is recorded and made available to the public on our PSC website and our YouTube channel. So you can always go back and find highlights of things you wanted to listen to more closely today. And those folks who couldn't make it today can always go back and watch. The series has been held regularly for several years, and it features experts from the US and Canada both. Today we'll hear from Laurie Weitkamp, and Laurie's from NOAA Fisheries, and Jennifer Boldt from Fisheries and Oceans Canada on the state of the North Pacific Ocean off Canada and the US. Jennifer's talk is entitled State of the Physical, Biological, and Selected Fishery Resources of Pacific Canadian Marine Ecosystems. For those of you who don't know her, Jennifer is a research scientist at DFO, studying coastal oceanic ecosystem science. She holds a BS from the University of Calgary and an MSc and PhD from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Jennifer works on pelagic ecosystem monitoring to detect the change in the status and trends of pelagic fish to understand the impacts of a changing climate on those ecosystems. She's also involved in the state of the ocean reporting, assessment of ecological impacts of environmental conditions at the ecosystem scale, and is interested in understanding links from physics to plankton to fish. Laurie will present on recent ocean conditions off the US West Coast. For those of you who don't know Laurie, she's been a research fisheries biologist at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center with NOAA since 1992. She holds 3 degrees from the University of Washington, a BS in zoology, an MS in fisheries, and a PhD in aquatic and fishery sciences. Laurie is a member of the PSC's Coho Tech Committee, and she led the West Coast Coho Salmon Status Review, which is the scientific basis for US Endangered Species Act listings. And she continues to contribute to updates for ESA-listed salmon populations in the United States. Laurie's primary research interests concern the estuarine and marine ecology of Pacific salmon and anadromous lampreys and the factors that affect their survival. Today, we'll hear from Laurie first, and then Jennifer, who joins us online remotely. At the end of the second presentation, at the end of Jennifer's presentation, we'll have several minutes for Q&A. We have runners in the room and a wireless mic. And those of you online, there are a number of folks who you can't see, but they've joined us online through the Zoom link. You can enter your questions in the Zoom chat, and we will read those out loud. With that, I think I can turn it over to Laurie. All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, John, and it is a pleasure to be here to do this, my annual ocean update. What I want to do is what I've been doing, which is really provide 3 things. Talk about the physical environmental drivers that are affecting the ocean, what the biological response has been, focusing on the stoplight chart that the Northwest Fisheries Science Center does, and then talk a little bit about what we think is going to happen in the future. So for physical environment drivers, we've got global temperatures, El Nino and La Nina, and then marine heat waves. And I hate to say it, but our planet is getting hot. 2024 was the warmest on record. This is the time series from NOAA showing the land temperatures on the upper plot and then sea surface temperatures on the bottom. You can see that 2024 is the highest one there. And not only is the sea surface temperature getting hot, but this is a new paper that just came out saying that the ocean heat content is also the hottest ever. And I think the point of this is that that heat is not going away anytime soon. It is here to stay. This is in zettajoules. A zettajoule is 10 to the 20th joules. That's a lot of heat that our oceans have absorbed. And it's at all depths as well. This is the top 2,000 meters of it. Even the deepest trenches are warming up as well. And that wasn't bad enough. The North Pacific has been warming faster than any other part of the ocean. So this is a new paper that just came out last summer showing that the North Pacific is getting warmer than other parts of the ocean. So great news. One of the issues I have is that when I look at this figure, I'm always kind of scratching my head, like, what do I do with it? How do I put this information into the things that I'm working on a day-to-day basis? And I saw a talk that had this press and pull of climate change that I thought was a really good framework, and it helped me understand. And the idea is that we have these long-term climate variabilities, we have short-term climate variability, these extreme events, which could be like rainstorms, what have you. And then on top of that, now we have climate change that is pressing on these systems. And the combined effect of all those is what this paper calls the experienced conditions. So what is it that the organisms are, whatever we're working on, is it actually experiencing? And then how does that affect the population size? And the idea is that back when climate change wasn't a big deal, you get an extreme event and it didn't really affect anything because it was within the variability. But because of this press of climate change, now we're getting up into what they call survivable extremes, and then also even further up into extinction extremes. And I just thought this is kind of a good way to think about how, the bar is going up. Species are getting pushed into conditions that they haven't evolved to. Okay. So one of the other big climate drivers we have are La Niñas and El Niños. These are these tropical phenomena. They're measured in the Nino 3-4 box out there. They're looking at sea surface temperature anomalies in that box. They're above half a degree above normal, then it's an El Nino event. And if it's below minus half a degree, it's a La Nina event. And we're interested in those in North America because it affects basically our snowpack and our weather. So during La Nina events on the left, it tends to be cold and wet in the northern tier of North America and drier in the southern tier. And during El Niños, it tends to be warm, farther north and dry and often wet. Not dry, cold and wet further south. So La Niñas are good for salmon, Northwest salmon, because we tend to have a cool ocean and we get a really good snowpack. El Niños, not so much. Warm ocean, low snowpack. Okay, so what's been going on? This is the record of the temperature anomalies in that El Nino 3-4 box. You can see we had big El Niños, 82, 83, 97, 98, 15, 16, and now we just got done with this 23, 24 El Nino. And then you can see a variety of La Niñas, the negative phase, the cold phase, including this three-peat that we had in 2020 to 2022, where we had 3 La Niñas in a row. And now we're at this kind of blah thing that it has gotten colder in the last 3 weeks at the equator, but up until that, it really wasn't, we weren't in La Nina status at all. It wasn't even below half a degree yet. So El Niños and La Niñas, not only, they're measured by measuring the sea surface temperature, but they also affect what we call the Walker circulation. And the Walker circulation is this pattern at the equator where in the Western Pacific, because the water tends to be warmer there, it gets pushed across the Pacific. You end up with this pool of warm water in the Indonesia, Papua New Guinea area. That causes evaporation. So you get a lot of warm air rising and it tends to then fall back down as precipitation. And on the eastern side of the Pacific, it's dry. So off of the coast of Chile, Ecuador, it's nice and dry and you get this circulation. That's kind of the neutral phase. When you get into an El Nino phase, the whole thing shifts over to the east because during El Ninos, the water is warm in the Eastern Pacific, so the wet part of it moves. And then in La Nina conditions, it's kind of an extreme of the neutral. So it's still, we have warm water over on the Western Pacific, cold water on the Eastern Pacific, and very wet in the Western Pacific, very dry in the Eastern. And what's really interesting is that even though we don't have a big La Nina at the equator right now, based on temperatures, we are still getting the classic La Nina circulation going on. So the people who work on this stuff are kind of scratching their heads. And what they kind of realize is that even though this La Nina box, this is sea surface temperature anomalies from December, even though it's not very cold at the equator relative to the historical record, it's actually pretty cold compared to the rest of the Pacific, because the Pacific is really, really, really warm right now, right? We're in new territory for the Pacific. So what they've come up with is this relative 3-4 index. So instead of comparing it to the historical record, they're comparing the temperatures into that the rest of the tropical Pacific. So it's relative to something different than what they've been using. And when they do that, they find that we're actually in an El Nino phase, and we've been in it since July, that it's been below -0.5 degree, whereas the traditional El Nino, it's above that. It's not an El Nino. And what they're finding is that if you look at the forecast, this is temperature or precipitation forecast for this winter, this looks like a fairly strong La Nina, even though we really don't, by traditional methods, we don't have a La Nina, but by this relative La Nina, it's fairly strong. So I think people are trying to figure out, okay, you know, how does this work? What are the mechanisms behind it? But I thought it was really interesting to kind of, this is another indicator that maybe we need to tweak a little bit, because it's not telling us what it used to tell us. Okay, we've also had this whole series of heat waves out in the ocean. And at some point, I think we're gonna have to stop calling them heat waves and just call them the new normal. It started with a blob in 2015, 2016, and that, again, we had the strong El Nino at the equator. We've had an El Nino, or a heat wave every year since then. 2023, we had the heat wave, and again, another strong El Nino. And 2024, there we are, another heat wave out there. Again, these are September. And you can see this mass of hot water in the Western Pacific that has implications for what the forecasts are going to show us. And you can also see, in this case, this cool water at the equator that's not cold like we would expect from a La Nina, but it's certainly cool. Okay, so what about biological responses? I'm going to talk mainly about our stoplight chart, but then a few other observations, and then Brian Burke's Columbia River salmon forecast. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the Northwest Center provides a stoplight chart. Each column is an ocean entry year, and we look at a variety of indicators that we think predict whether the ocean is essentially good or bad for salmon. And this is really tuned for the Columbia River salmon, but it actually works pretty well as an indicator of general ocean conditions. Rockfish recruitment, sablefish recruitment, actually sardines, all work based on this chart in opposite or in different directions. And so we have ocean basin scale indicators, local physical indicators, and then these biological indicators. And at the bottom are the ranks. And it's color coded so that red means it's bad for the salmon that enter the ocean in that year, in that column. That indicator, if it's red, it means it's bad for salmon. And generally those are associated with warm conditions, with not a lot to eat. The green colors are cool, with a lot of prey to consume, and then yellow is neither good nor bad. It's kind of intermediate. And these are just, we've assigned them by thirds. So 2024, the rank was 18th out of 27 years. So it's right on the cusp of being red, which is not great, but it's okay. So what contributed to that? As far as these ocean basin scale indicators, you can see the PDO shows up as green. It's been strongly negative. It continues to be strongly negative, but it turns out it doesn't actually work very well the way it used to work. And ask me about that at the when we get to the questions. The PDO, or not, excuse me, the El Nino La Nina index was red because we're on the tail end of that strong 23-24 El Nino, which is shown in this box there. As far as local physical indicators, it was generally pretty warm. off the Washington, Oregon coast, again, because of the tail end of this 23-24 El Nino, and upwelling was modest, but ended early as well. And the blue there, the top graph is sea surface temperature anomalies from 7 different buoys that we use off the Washington, Oregon coast. The buoys have been going out or drifting off to places they shouldn't be. So we've kind of got 7 that we use consistently. And you can see the blue below average temperatures in the middle of summer. That's classic upwelling. Wind blows hard, forces cold, nutrient-rich water to be brought up to the surface off our coast. And in the long-term time series on the bottom, this is just one of the buoys we look at. You can see that the last bit of that is kind of right at average or slightly above average. As far as copepods, this is the base of the food chain. Most salmon that we study don't eat copepods, but they eat the things that do eat the copepods. We have the northern copepods, which are kind of the cheeseburgers. They have a large lipid sac in them, and they tend to be larger bodied. The southern copepods don't have a lipid sac. They're the celery. They tend to be smaller, and so we pay attention to the ratio of those two. And it was kind of mixed. Because of the remnants of the El Nino, there was still a lot of southern copepods around, but we also had some northern copepods. And then we had a really late spring transition, which is when it shifts from the winter community, which is mainly southern copepods, to the northern copepods, which are dominant in the summer. That happened quite late this year compared to normal. So we think that's important because it's the base of the food web. We also look at catches of larval fish that are out there before the salmon actually entered the ocean. Those were very, very low, and it was mainly offshore species, which we don't think are great for salmon, things like sardines and some of the rockfish. And then finally, we look at catches of juvenile salmon, Chinook and coho, in our surveys that we do off the Washington, Oregon coast in June, and showing the trend here. So Chinook on the top, these are yearlings. So spring Chinook coming out of the Columbia, it was the 14th out of these 27 years, and coho was the 5th out of the 27 years. So above average catches of coho, average for Chinook. And that's how we get to this kind of average year, slightly below average year based on the stoplight chart. I think it's important, though, that these catches actually help predict how many salmon are going to return. So this is using the juvenile salmon catches in our survey for Chinook to predict how many jacks are going to get counted going over Bonneville Dam a year later, and adults 2 years later. And you can see they're decent regressions on those. And for coho, it also works. It's a little noisier, but it suggests we're going to get modest Chinook returns in 2026 and potentially high returns of coho next year, which would be great. Some of the other things we catch in our surveys, and I've got a map there showing the stations up in the upper left corner. You can see that some things are pretty average, which is, again, surprising given that we had fairly warm water. So market squid, pompano, sea nettle, they've been elevated. They're not anymore. And others are still elevated, like jack mackerel and water jellies were both relatively high. So kind of a mix of signals as to what's going on. These are Brian Burke's predictions for Chinook and steelhead from the Columbia. And this is based on my understanding is this is the dynamic regression based on the PC1 of the stoplight chart. So you can see for 25 and 26 are the last 2 points on each of these graphs. Suggests that 25 is going to be about like 24, but 26 is going to be down a bit. So we shall see if that pans out. And this is all online. Forecast. So what's going to happen? Got La Nina, El Nino, and ocean temperatures. So for La Nina, they just this week, or actually the end of last week changed. So we are now in officially La Nina conditions. They're expected to persist this for the rest of the spring and then transition to El Nino or neutral conditions by March, April, May. period. This is the latest sea surface temperature anomalies from 2 weeks ago at the equator, showing a little deeper blue, little colder water. And this is just the predictions from that. So time is at the bottom on both of these. It goes from December, January, February on the left part of the graphs to August, September, October. And you can see the blue bars decrease in the left-hand side, which is the probability of a La Nina, and then the gray bars start coming up because that's neutral conditions. And then these are a bunch of model predictions. This has not been updated since the beginning of December. I think next week the new updates come out. It's just showing the results of a whole bunch of different dynamic models and statistical models and what they think the El Nino is going to do. And it doesn't, none of them show like this huge La Nina coming or anything, which is, I think, the main point of that. Again, this is the precipitation forecast for this winter, showing fairly wet conditions up in our neck of the woods, dry down in California. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And as far as the sea surface temperature anomalies, this is showing what the NOAA model is forecasting. So we've got the La Nina at the equator that is slowly fading over time. And that's a lot of red and orange through the North Pacific. That's really warm, on the order of 1 to 2, perhaps 3 degrees above average, the long-term average. It is nice that along our coast, it stays relatively cool. It's quote unquote average, which these days is good. You don't get a lot of blue anymore on these graphs. So that's what we have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer to give the BC version.
Well, thanks for including me today in your seminar series. I'm located at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo. Sorry, I couldn't be there in person. And so I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the traditional and ancestral territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, who are past, present, and future caretakers of this particular area. And just to clarify, each year, Fisheries and Oceans Canada has a State of the Ocean meeting, and that's the long title on the title slide there. We call it SOPO for short, for make it more efficient. I am a co-convener and an editor of that SOPO meeting and report that we produce every year. And so from that report, I've assembled some information for this particular presentation, and I've updated some with some information that I was able to update. And then Bronwyn McDonald and Sue Grant really helped me with some providing some slides. They put together an annual State of the Salmon or Salmon Outlook report or information. So I really relied on their expertise for the salmon part of this. And so here's the full list of all the co-authors. Jackie King also helped me with this presentation. Most of these people, I've borrowed their information from the SOPO report, and most of them are from DFO, but there are some from PSC, particularly Steve Latham and others. And this QR code leads you to the SOPO report online. For our latest one was for 2023 conditions, and there's another link to that elsewhere. And so in the report, we cover off this area around British Columbia and then some of the broader ecosystem information. And what I'll cover off today is a little bit of information about freshwater habitats, and then primarily the marine habitat, in particular the physical environment, the prey of salmon and the predators of salmon, and then also some salmon indices. And just for frame of reference, in the map there, it shows Vancouver Island as one of the main features in British Columbia. We have Haida Gwaii up north. And then that line P, we often have a lot of oceanographic and zooplankton and nutrient information from that line P transect. And then the Strait of Georgia and Salish Sea are between the Vancouver Island and the mainland of British Columbia and Washington, just to orient you. And so DFO is responsible for managing and studying the 5 species of salmon. And of course, as you know, they spend part of their life in freshwater and part in marine water. And the amount of time they spend in each depends on the species and the life history stage. And so Sue and Bronwyn have put together this nice picture for people like me who don't study salmon directly anymore, to understand the different life history strategies and how much each fish spend in each part of the ecosystem. And so freshwater habitat will be affected by air temperature, precipitation, snow, river flows, among other things. And that salmon that will be returning in 2025 will have been exposed to freshwater conditions in 2020 through 2023. And so these maps show the spring air, maximum spring air temperature anomalies in May for those 4 years, plus also 2024 as looking ahead. So you can see that 2020 was a little bit warmer than average. 2021 looks average, but that was the year that we had the deadly heat dome. 2022 looks kind of cooler than average. 2023 was warmer than average, and 2024 looked generally average. However, by the time you get to the summer in August, both 2022 and 2024 also became quite warm, warmer than average. So that doesn't bode well for a lot of the river systems. And we know from research that Dave Patterson and others have been doing that warmer summer temperatures aren't great for salmon migrating up to their spawning grounds. It's common now to have temperatures exceeding 18 degrees Celsius at some point in the spring and summer, and temperatures above this 18-degree mark can result in decreased adult salmon swimming performance. And then if you get above 20 degrees, it can cause adult mortality or disease and changes to egg viability and legacy effects for juveniles. We don't have annual temperatures for a lot of the rivers in BC, but we do have them for the Fraser River systems, and summer temperatures regularly exceed these upper temperature thresholds, particularly in these years 21, 22, and 23. And with regards to drought in BC, which can affect river flows as well, and temperatures, I've just taken screenshots off the province's website. The details of this slide doesn't matter, it's just the colors that matter. So I've got boxes for 2020 through 2024. And within each of those, the columns represents a different week within a year, from like May or June through to October. And then the different rows within each year represent different snow basins in British Columbia. And so you can see in 2020, it was generally okay in terms of drought. The brown, red, and orange colors, or actually it's the orange, red, and brown, indicate adverse impacts are possible, likely, or almost certain. So any of the orange, red, or brown indicates a bad drought conditions. And you can see that in 2021, a lot of the snow basins within BC were in drought conditions, and that was during the heat dome and throughout most of the summer. 2022, the late summer, fall time period is when we started to see these orange and red, brown colors. So drought conditions started to increase in the fall. 2023 looks very different from every other year. Drought all year, all snow basins. It was a bad year. 2024 looks a tiny bit better, but still drought conditions in the late summer and early fall. And then if we look at snowpack in those snow basins, this is again for those 5 years. Unfortunately, the color legend's different for 21 and 22. I couldn't change it, but all you need to know is that dark green and dark blues mean higher than normal snowpack, and then red and orange mean lower than normal snowpack. And so again, you can see that it's different among years, but the last couple of years, the snowpack has been low, and that'll also affect river temperatures and flow. And then there's also changes to river topography, sediment, and trace element inputs through wildfires. And you can see in 2023, we had a really high level or amount of hectares that were burnt in British Columbia. And the changes to the tree canopy through forest fires or other pressures like insects or logging can affect slope stability and the amount of sediment that's put into rivers. And then we also have had these significant floods which can wash away newly spawned eggs. So those are some of the freshwater pressures. And then when we get to the marine environment, the salmon that are returning in 2025 will have been exposed to conditions in 2022 through 2025, depending on species and life history strategy. And what we see in the ocean is this long-term increasing temperature that Laurie mentioned. This shows data for BC shore stations, and the black line shows this linear increasing trend of about 0.85 degrees Celsius per 100 years. And then the red bars show that temperatures have been anomalously warm in the last decade or so. And then also, as Laurie mentioned, we've seen this increased frequency and occurrence of marine heat waves. In 2021, at least in the waters off British Columbia, over the whole year, it was generally average, although, as Laurie mentioned, there was a marine heat wave in the broader Pacific. In 2022, which is shown in the middle panel here, there's 4 panels there. That's for the spring or winter, spring, summer, and fall. And again, it was near normal overall, but again, there was this marine heat wave in the summer, fall time period. And then when you get to 2023, again, there was the summer, fall heat wave, which I'll show on the next slide here. The top left shows the marine or sea surface temperature anomalies the latter part of July through the early part of August. And you can see that the waters around British Columbia are anomalously warm. The right-hand panel shows that the marine heat wave is still there in August, but maybe the temperatures around BC are moderated a little bit by then. The bottom graph here shows the percent of British Columbia's exclusive economic zone that's covered by marine heat waves in 2023 with the red line and 2022 with the gray bars. And you can see that there is a significant proportion of BC's EEZ covered in marine heat waves in 2023 and 2022, but the timing of those changes between years. Another thing that we're observing in British Columbia is an increased and widespread occurrence of hypoxia events. So as just one example, this shows, the left map shows a little squiggly line there, and that's a glider transect, an instrument that they set into the water and they drive it along that transect, and they collect a bunch of physical environmental data. And it's across the South Queen Charlotte Sound in summer in 2023. And the right-hand graphs show the cross-section of that transect. So the depth is shown on the y-axis, and then the top graph is 2021. The red area is hypoxic water, and you can see that it's off the shelf, that gray area there. But in 2022 and 2023, the hypoxic water moves onto the shelf, which is something that they hadn't seen previously. And it's not just this one area. There were several other researchers that noted they observed hypoxic events in the areas that they monitor, for example, off the southwest coast of Vancouver Island in the fall, and then off Haida Gwaii in the fall as well. Another thing I should say about the hypoxic events is that they're also moving farther up in the water column. Another thing that we look at, and what Laurie mentioned, is spring upwelling. We look at the timing of transition to spring upwelling, and then also the magnitude of upwelling. And so this graph, the far right blue bar there is the 2023 upwelling. You can see it started in about May, which is later than average. And the blue color indicates that it had below average magnitude of upwelling. And both of those things, the late start and the low magnitude, indicate or are associated with below average coastal productivity. So maybe not the best conditions for things further up the food web like zooplankton and salmon. And we do monitor zooplankton as well. This shows the zooplankton copepod communities over time. And as Laurie mentioned, the zooplankton community composition can affect the quality available to predators like salmon, and juvenile and adult salmon like pink salmon eat zooplankton. And during that 2014 through 2016 marine heat wave or blob, there was fewer northern and boreal copepods, or the lipid-rich copepods, and more of the southern or celery-like copepods. And then in recent years, it's returned to more of a normal composition, but then also similar to what Laurie said in 2023, I think it was 2023 for Laurie, but in 2023 off the west coast of Vancouver Island, we observed an increase in southern copepods, but near average northern and boreal copepods. We also monitor zooplankton in the Strait of Georgia, where a lot of salmon enter when they're juveniles. And the abundance there has been above average in the last 6 years, and that includes a salmon prey such as amphipods, euphausids, and decapod larvae. Other prey that are available for juvenile salmon, particularly juvenile Chinook and coho salmon, include age 0 herring. And in the Strait of Georgia, we have an age 0 herring survey in the fall to look at relative abundance of age 0 herring. And you can see that previously, the last 10 years prior to 2023, the index of abundance of age 0 herring was lower than average. But in 2023, we had this uptick in abundance, which is good news for juvenile salmon. However, we also look at the proportion of sets where we collect anchovy, and that's been high in recent years, and it still was elevated in 2023. And that may or may not be good for salmon. We know that it might be an alternate prey, but with recent research, that might also cause thiamine deficiency in salmon. And when we look at the north and west coast of Vancouver Island in the summer, that's where all mixed ages of herring will forage in the summer, and they can also form prey for salmon. The right-hand side of this slide shows the distribution of biomass of herring over time from 2006 to 2023, with some gaps in years there. But you can see that a lot of herring are concentrated off the southwest coast of Vancouver Island. The left plot shows the biomass of herring over time, and it has increased over time. 2023 was the second highest biomass in the time series. And this corresponds to what is seen in the stock assessment output for herring. This shows a stock assessment estimated coastwide spawning biomass for the 5 major stocks of herring in British Columbia, with Strait of Georgia representing 50% of the recent biomass. And you can see it increased between, say, about 2010 and 2020, and then has leveled off since then. Of course, it varies among areas how the herring are doing. And then we know that groundfish are predators of salmon. There was a report by Pearsall and Fargo in 2007 that showed, for example, that petrale sole and lingcod consume chum, pink, and sockeye salmon, and other groundfish like dogfish consume coho salmon. And DFO conducts groundfish surveys, and it has seen an increase in some of these predators, like the petrale sole on the left and lingcod in the middle. But they've also seen a decrease in dogfish on the right. Pacific hake may also be a predator and or competitor for salmon. And the US NOAA and DFO have a joint survey of hake off the west coast of North America, and they saw the 3rd lowest biomass recorded in 2023. In Canada's waters, they saw the lowest proportion of the stock migrating to Canada and the lowest biomass in Canada. So it's quite a change from previous years. There are also marine mammal predators, and I've just shown a couple here. For example, harbor seals. They did a survey during 2015 through 19 where they surveyed most of BC's coasts. They got an estimate of harbor seal numbers, and given the degree of uncertainty in their estimates, the stock is considered stable or slightly declining. But again, the abundance varies depending on which region you're in within BC. With regards to California sea lions, their abundance was estimated in 2021, and the number was something like 13,000 animals, and that was a 3-fold increase since they observed them in 2009, but not a significant increase since they observed them in 2017. And then with regards to cetaceans, some whale populations are increasing, whereas others have not. So for example, we all know that the southern resident killer whales are endangered. The northern residents are threatened, maybe increasing a little bit though. Big's killer whales, the sightings of those have increased in the Salish Sea, and that's coincident with harbor seals. And then humpback whales, there was a recovery from past exploitation, but we saw with a recent publication that the total North Pacific population declined during 2013 through 2018, which authors attributed to heat wave effects on prey resources. And those same authors, Cheeseman et al., found that the North Pacific was carrying capacity limited for humpback whales, and that capacity was limited due to this rapid climate change, they think. So as mentioned, we also have surveys of juvenile salmon in British Columbia. So there's this one survey or multiple surveys off the continental shelf of Vancouver Island. There's one in the summer, which is shown on the left column of plots here, and then another one in the fall, which is on the right. And then the different species are listed from top to bottom. And so depending on which species you're looking at, you'll have to look at different years of the survey index to identify which returns they would represent. These indices are estimated with a spatial temporal model, so that allows them to estimate the index when they didn't have a survey year. So that's shown in open circles here, although I'm not sure you'll be able to see it. It's pretty small. But just I'll run through a few examples. So for example, 2024, the coho that they saw in the 2023 survey in the fall was above average in terms of catch. So it's expected that perhaps 2024 returns were above average. And that's for the West Coast, Strait of Georgia, and Puget Sound stocks. And then for Chinook, if we look at the 2021 index there, they were below average. And that would be for ocean type West Coast stocks generally. And then for 2025 returns, the Chinook that we observed in 2022 were above average. So perhaps good news for them. And that would again be the ocean type West Coast of Vancouver Island stocks. Whereas the sockeye salmon were near average in the survey. So maybe an average return in 2025. And then for 2026, the 2023 survey, summer and fall indices, or actually, sorry, just the fall index was above average. So maybe that's good news for Chinook salmon returning in 2026. And the chum in 2023 were above average, both in the summer and fall. So perhaps good news for 2026 returns. And then there's also surveys in the Strait of Georgia, both in June and September. Here I've only shown September survey results for the 5 species. And just one example of 2024 returns, perhaps the coho that were sampled in the 2023 survey were the highest on record in terms of CPUE and also the largest in size. So that's, I think, corresponds with what Laurie had seen in the juvenile coho surveys, in the yearling coho. And then we also have records of salmon size. So this is Steve Latham and others' work. And on the left, they've shown the body weights of pink salmon that are caught in Juan de Fuca Strait fisheries. And you can see that generally there's been this decline in body weight over time. And in 2023, the pink salmon were the second smallest on record. On the right, that shows sockeye salmon lengths on spawning grounds. And again, there's been changes in the lengths of sockeye over time. And the average length for the 3 ocean sockeye was the 6th lowest in 2023, whereas the 2 ocean sockeye were pretty much near average in 2023. So some changes there in salmon size. And so that's all I was going to show, but it does show that climate change is one of the dominant pressures acting on the Northeast Pacific, and that affects not only the physical environment, but also the biological environment with cascading effects up the food web. And with that, I guess we're going to take questions. So thanks, Hajka.
Thanks, Jennifer. We do have got a little more than half an hour for questions. Any here in the room? And Marissa's checking online. Go ahead, Milo.
It's a question for Laurie. You were talking about taking some of these indices and recalibrating them for trends. Has anybody done that with PDO, and what does it show?
Not that I know of, but there is a paper in press right now from a colleague of Nate Mantua's showing that global climate change is now the primary signal you're getting from the PDO. And that the pattern of sea surface temperature anomalies around the North Pacific has now become the second orthogonal function or principal component. And that the PDO signal, the second one, no longer relates to coastal sea surface temperatures, that there's this divergence. So it's really not telling us what it used to at all, which is really interesting. So I don't know what you do with that. I mean, I think it'd be really interesting to run a bunch of regressions like the stoplight chart, because those are, I mean, there's a regression behind every indicator we've got, and just see how far off is it? Is it still useful or not, even though it doesn't really work and it's telling you something different. But, oh, the question was what to do with things like the PDO that are not working the way they used to anymore.
Yeah.
Is this like the weather? Everybody complains about it, but nobody does anything about it. How is this connected to actual action to do something with the data?
I think that's kind of what the workshop tomorrow is. The question is what to do with the fact that things are changing, and what do you do with it as salmon managers? I think we're going to get into that tomorrow with the workshop. I don't have good advice other than that's the way it is. I mean, things are changing. There's absolutely no question. Things are changing. Our regressions are falling apart, and we need to, I guess I would say, come up with ways to manage that don't rely as strongly for forecasts or whatever else, these regressions. And the salmon are responding to it. I mean, that's what we're trying to describe, the environment that they're living in. What are they dealing with? And so it's very real for them. I mean, they're dealing with these things. And so we've got to figure out, as humans that are trying to catch them or allow enough to come back to provide future generations, how are we going to do that, given that the tools that we've developed aren't working very well?
It looks like
Jennifer, yes, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, Laurie, what does it look like in terms of predators or competitors of salmon off the west coast of the US? Do you know?
Yeah, so you had the hake. I mean, that's one of the big ones. Actually, the California market squid was one that I was very concerned about. We know that California market squid consume a lot of the same things that salmon, juvenile salmon do, and their population had been climbing up. In fact, we were getting California market squid all the way up into Alaska, and that population seems to have declined. I think they're going back down again. Squid in general are ecological opportunists. So they have very short lifespans. They have really, really high fecundity, and they can exploit these, opportunities that suddenly open up one year, but may not be there in future years. So those have gone down. The sablefish is a big concern. We're starting to see sablefish recruitment. In fact, I think throughout the Northeast Pacific, there's been really, really high sablefish. Up in Alaska, you guys are getting lots of sablefish. When they're really small, they compete with salmon. When they get big enough, they can eat salmon. And when they're really, really small, they're prey for salmon. So it just depends on, where they are in the cycle relative to salmon. But I think that's part of what's going on with temperatures warming up. Things are changing. Each of these different species, you've got winners and losers, and the species that can take advantage of these new conditions are doing great, and it has whole new implications for salmon as to whether it's impacting them or not. And I should say sablefish are known to grow incredibly quickly. They can eat a lot more than a salmon can. Huge gut capacity. So potentially overcompeting salmon. Yeah.
You have the mic coming.
Yeah, hang on just a second. Let's get the mic.
I was wondering if you had seen this 485 million years of ocean warming and cooling chart that's been making the rounds, Emily Judd paper. how old evolutionarily are salmon in comparison to that time frame? You know, they're looking back 485 million years into Earth's history and plotting ocean warming and cooling. And where do salmon, how long are salmon on that?
That's a good question. I don't have my point of reference is Ray Troll's figure that salmon waiting or trout waiting for the dinosaurs to go away, right? So 50 million years, a geneticist in the room could probably tell you what it is. They've been around for a long time. There's no question. I think a lot of it, I haven't seen the paper in specifically. I mean, we know that there's been ice ages, there's been warm periods. There used to be palm trees around here, right? If you go back far enough. The issue is that it's changing just very, very rapidly compared to any of these historic cooling and warming periods. And so things aren't having time to adapt. And it's, I mean, you look at us as humans, we're not adapting very well right now. For anybody who lives in Southern California, that's a lot of change really, really quickly. And so because things are changing so rapidly, it makes it more difficult than previous.
I'd like to see graphically salmon on the chart of,
Yeah,
you know, geologic warming and are the trends. I'd like to see.
yeah. And I work on lamprey, Pacific lamprey. Pacific lamprey have been around for 400 million years. That's 300 million years before the dinosaurs. They're the original fish. And we're really worried about those as well. So we know they can adapt. I mean, that's what salmon do, is adapt and modify themselves to take advantage of all these opportunities given enough time. And it's the time that I think is a big concern.
Thank you.
So first of all, I'd like to thank you for the presentation. I've learned a lot over the years by these presentations. And in I guess, my long history on this planet of fishing and observation, which is 72 years tomorrow from birth, and actually fishing, I can say with certainty 1960, a 7-year-old on a coastal river out of a dugout canoe in a land where there was hardly any people. Wasn't even a bridge over that US 101 until 1932. We didn't get electricity until 1968. I've been involved as an adult since the late 70s, early 80s with the Quinault Indian Nation. And I'm like a citizen scientist because I walk my coast a lot. And I've reported different observations and this past summer and the summer before, for several of them, when you talk about looking at those moorings out there that produce data, well, there was only 2 moorings when we got involved, the coastal tribes in particular, you know, starting in 1992 coming forward. So when I see this today, where I see the warm water going into deeper water, and these hypoxic events, you know, I walked the coast last year and this year, and saw things that I hadn't seen previously, and I've been paying attention. And so what I saw was pelicans in the heart of a cove that we have. And I saw the other birds. And there was like 200 pelicans. And they were dropping out of the sky and hitting the water and coming up. And the shiny, different kinds of fish were coming out. So I got a hold of the biologist at Quinault. And I told them what I saw. And what I thought was that there was a hypoxic event. So they looked at the moorings and he called me back and said, we're having a hypoxic event. So one of the things that I guess I'm concerned about is the farther out and the deeper it gets, the more it's gonna impact us. Now, these are the ones on the bottom that can't escape, right? They can't get out of harm's way. But the tool that this is bringing to us is the opportunity to look at how did we do business before? What data did we rely on? And is it any good anymore? And the answer is no. I mean, we could talk about the these adaptive salmon, but when those adults get to the river and die pre-spawn because the water's too low and there's no oxygen in it, they can do all they can do out there in the ocean to find those cool spots, but they can't find those cool spots in our natal streams. The graphic up there that shows you the colors and whether it's going to rain or not, and it's, we're at the mercy of that because there's no snow anymore. Then these other indicators come along like fire. Well, fire takes the cover away. That's why the water goes off those mountains and hills into the river and it's gone. No way to hold that. So I think our challenge is to look at how we managed when there was certainty. How do we manage now with uncertainty? And those of us in the room, we all should be worried about that, no matter where you're from, because when the fish are gone, so are we. When the fish are gone, we're out of business. I mean, that's the only way that the Pacific Salmon Commission is going to be put out of business. I mean, we're going to face budget challenges and things, but it's going to take us to analyze what you technical folks bring to us to write into these next annexes what we're going to do to protect all of us and these valuable resources, however that comes from wherever you're from. For us, it's different than others that go out there and, recreate and do things like that. It's our culture and our way of life. And so I'm really wanting us to think about, well, and I know that's what all these series of different series are. Got to take that and put them into actionable items that we're going to have to fight like heck in Canada and fight like heck in the US to get the resources to do the work that says we need to do these things, and or we're just simply not going to have salmon anymore. And salmon goes, so do other things. And I myself have to lean into our policy folks in this room to work with our analysts and our technical folks and figure out these guidelines that say, we're going to do a 5-year review. A lot of our, as we observed Dr. Gary Morishima probably in this room a couple of years ago, when he received the Larry Rudder Award, he talked a little bit about Gary Morishima. But really, when it comes to the end of the day, we can't harvest manage it our way out of this predicament that we are in. So we have to bring that environmental uncertainty into the room and figure out. And I know it's not this challenge, this charge in these 10-year reviews, because all that's wrapped around harvest management. But if we have all that uncertainty, what we used to do is no longer valid. Or as you walk us through these, red and blue and yellow, it used to have relevancy, but by and large, that's all gone. So when we scrub all of these intersects about how to do the best we can here. And then our other efforts, all of us that are in the, as my brother Guy McMines used to say, the fish business, is to lean into that other environmental side to make those changes because it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
So don't know if it's proper for me, but from where I come from, where my job is to leave this place better and for the 7th generation, it requires me to figure out how can I help? How can we get this work done?
Yeah. No, and I totally agree. I mean, it's happening. We need to take this very seriously and focus on the fish, perhaps not as much on the fisheries, because if we don't have fish, we're not going to have fisheries. No, I'm with you on that. And I think bring a lot of those thoughts with tomorrow to the workshops, because I think we're going to be talking about this. And I'm with you completely. Let's not wait for the big crash. You know, I mean, Fraser sockeye is already looking pretty grim, but let's not wait for Chinook or Coho or whatever else to crash. We can get ahead of this. I mean, we kind of know what to do. We need to make the effort and really, I think about as a organization, how do we deal with the fact that we are dealing with a cold water fish, cold water species in a warming ocean, and take it seriously and really do something. Anyway, question from the back.
Hey, Laurie, Tom Manager, Fishing Salmon, Alaska. 2 years ago, we were in a dingy basement in Portland. We gave a very similar presentation, and at the time, there was sort of the thought that, like, well, we're out of the blog, which is good, but what's coming is maybe worse, and it's very scary. And that was the sort of takeaway, and we were like, well, we're not, you know, the immediate data is like pretty terrifying, like buckle up, things are gonna be bad. Which was pretty frightening. And I guess, did they, now that we have 2 years, my first question is, did they turn out that way?
You know, I think it really depends on what stock you're talking about. Certainly there's a lot of populations, Yukon River, Chinook and Chum look pretty grim. Fraser River sockeye does not look very good. The second lowest on record. And for the second time now, we've had more sockeye in the Columbia than we have in the Fraser, which is really scary. There are populations though that have kind of figured out how to make it work, which amazes me. I look at those heat waves and I think, wow, nothing that goes out there is going to do very well. And yet we've had pretty good fall Chinook returns. We've had decent Coho returns. And I think it's them, it's really the devil is in the details, because every single species uses the ocean differently. Every stock uses the ocean differently in when they enter, where they go within that. And it's that detail. Ocean is an enormous place, the North Pacific. I mean, we're talking migrations that are thousands of kilometers in the ocean, and we don't have a good sense of where exactly that is, and they can thread that needle and make it work. And I think particularly for stocks in my neck of the woods, lower 48, that upwelling provides a really critical buffer for stocks that stay on the continental shelf when they first get out into the ocean. So Coho, fall Chinook, perhaps some of the sockeyes that are heading up north. Because we have upwelling, it's bringing this cold, nutrient-rich water up to the surface, and they stay in that range. So their first summer, when we think a lot of the mortality is happening, works. Others, I'm not sure, you know. So there's things that are going up and things that are going down. Pick your stock. Yeah.
I appreciate that take on it. It's nice to hear that in this environment. My experience then was to go out and go, oh man, like this is gonna be bad.
Yeah.
Because you were talking about pretty narrow group in Alaska. So
yeah.
Fishermen and sockeye folks, and then what did we come to find out? Like, oh, it was a massive thing in the air. It was huge. And then, you know, a year later, it was a huge run of sockeye in the schema. So it was kind of funny to be like, the world is falling down. Oh, no,
yeah. No, and that's the challenge of trying to come up with some indicators. We know the salmon are are responding to the environment that they're in. It makes or breaks, you know, is there a lot of food wherever they happen to be or not? Is it cold or is it not, or the appropriate temperatures? And we really don't know where that is for most of these stocks. So yeah, it is challenging. I'm surprised, honestly, that as many stocks came through as well as they did, given that we had really warm conditions, and we've been having really warm conditions.
And I guess maybe there's a lesson in that too, to like temper our expectations for terror as well as for success.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm showing you what we know is out there. That's my job as far as I'm concerned. Everybody who provides a forecast needs to figure out, what do we do with this information? How is it affecting our population? I don't have any particular inside insight, but I can tell you what we think is happening.
Well, I mean, the red light, green light is forecasting.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You're-
no, it
you're
is,
delving-
it
you're-
is.
You're taking temperatures and then you're delving directly into forecasting.
Yeah.
And we're talking, you know, we already had this conversation earlier in this conversation was like, well, what do we do about that? That's tomorrow. And so I guess my point is simply like, we need to temper some of our,
Yeah,
you know, warm and bad expectations with like, well, let's buckle up and see what happens.
yeah. So I would say down here, warm is bad. Up where you are, perhaps warm is not that bad. That it's actually good. If you talk to the Russians, they'll tell you that the reason they got lots of pink salmon is warm. What used to be too cold is now just about right.
Well,
Right. Yeah.
I guess up where I am is also part of the process, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
Don't
but-
forget.
Yeah, no, I mean, the bottom line is it's really complicated. Absolutely. We have, you know, what's the classic saying? Counting fish is just like counting trees, except you can't see them and they move, right? I mean, that's what we're dealing with. And in a changing environment that yesterday doesn't predict tomorrow very well anymore. How do we deal with this?
Well, I've been involved in this process for over 40 years. And we meet several times a year thinking we can solve this problem. We don't have the resources to solve this problem. The people that do on the human side, that do have some ability to fix some of these problems, aren't here. They aren't involved in this process. The loggers, the developers, the water consumers, the water polluters, the managers of the resources that do consume salmon, that are overpopulated, and we don't do anything about it, is part of the problem. You know, from the beach out over to Japan and China, we can't do anything other than the work that you're doing to bring it to light. But there are things we can do to modify the impact, and it's not part of this process. Hopefully that's something that can come out of tomorrow. Saying, not only do we need to stop and modify our harvest, which that's almost a joke at this point. We don't have much harvest. You know, on the freighter, the US side, one maybe out of 4 years that we possibly get to fish. But logging is still continuing, development is still continuing, water consumption is still continuing. They aren't part of this process, and they could make a difference. NOAA could make a difference with marine mammal predation on fish going up and coming back,
Yep.
that they're doing nothing with.
Wait till Trump gets in office.
But we're loaded and ready to go. But it's stuff like that that's very frustrating. And you know, I'd like to see the graph that says, oh, in 1985, this is the run size of every species of all 5 species. here 40 years later, here's where we are. And have us face each other and pass the red face test that we're doing a great job. Because it doesn't mean that people aren't doing hard work. I don't mean to put anything on individuals that are doing their job, but have a report card saying, here's where we are. Look how many billions of dollars we've spent to get here. Now, something needs to change, and we don't have that level of discussion. I hope that we do start that this year, because why?
Yeah.
Why are we here? If this is the result, we can do that staying home.
Yeah.
But okay.
No,
That's
and salmon are incredibly challenging because they use, they go from headwaters all the way out into the ocean and back again, and they are being impacted along their entire life cycle, whether it's human activities or climate change, whatever. They are taking it in the shorts. There's absolutely no question. And there's a lot of it, like you're saying, that we don't, in this room, we don't control those activities. So,
But so do the tribes.
yeah. Yeah.
Both sides.
Maybe some of the wants from the commission that we come up with are, like you said, marine mammal predation. I mean, we have it terrible up north. When are we gonna recognize that a lot of these marine mammals have become smart and they need to be trimmed back? That would be the wishes that I would have for the commission, to make the hard decisions with the people that think seals and sea lions are warm and fuzzy, but to scare them out of the rivers again, so these fish that do survive the gauntlet of all the conditions that they always have to survive to come back to spawn can actually do their job. And those are things I can see we can facilitate. Reforestations of the watersheds, wherever we have fires in the watersheds, plant right away as fast as we can. And I mean, those are the things that we can change. The rest of it, I mean, we're all along for the ride. And, the information a couple of years ago we had with the COA study that came back that showed that the dust from tires is toxic to baby coas. I mean, what in the world are we going to do about that? I mean, we could be an advocate group for sure, and I'd certainly like to be, because we're not even giving those little buggers a chance to grow up, So yeah, I'm an advocate to do the things we can do. We all support them, marine mammals especially. It's like, that's something we can ask this new administration to do, because I think they'd probably do it in a heartbeat.
Yep.
Does Jen have any closing
Questions
thoughts?
online? Jennifer, do you want to comment on closing thoughts?
No, I think, the questions are all super interesting and valid, and it's interesting to hear the discussion there. One thing I was going to ask you is I'm not aware, what is the workshop tomorrow, and how are these things that you're talking about today going to be incorporated tomorrow?
Thanks, Jen. That is a good segue into my closing remarks. Tomorrow's workshop will be 10 to 12 in this room. It's part of the series hosted by the Committee on Scientific Cooperation. It's part of their multi-year work plan, and it is to introduce this subject of accounting for changing population dynamics when providing salmon management advice. And so it's exactly what Laurie referred to. It's trying to connect what we're hearing in the environment and environmental signals to what could or should be done in practical ways and under the treaty or in general for salmon management. I'll get to you in just a sec. So for those of you who are interested and available, I encourage you to come tomorrow at 10. We do have a good presentation. You'll see it in the material that I sent out just a couple hours ago. I sent a reminder out to the entire community. Please take a look at that and come if you can, and come ready with the questions that didn't get answered today or that you want to explore further tomorrow. I'll also end by saying that the seminar steering committee that puts together these events and plans them out each year is looking for new members, new volunteers. You're paid twice as much as everyone else on the committee. Tomorrow. But if you are interested, please email the general inbox at the secretary. It's just info@psc.org, and we will get you connected to the seminar steering committee. We would very much appreciate another wave of support to help plan these out, find speakers, and get these events planned and executed in the next year or so. We had one question in the back.
Your whole description of the CSC process. I was just wondering how it was different than what salmon managers do every day.
Come and find out. So with that, I think we've reached the end. We have no questions online. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for including me.
Bye, Jennifer.
Bye.